Hello again. Here we are moving on to chapter 3, fetal development. Hopefully it'll get a little bit more interesting from here. I think each week it gets a little bit more interesting. But fetal development. Let's continue on. Here's your objectives. We're just going to talk really about how fetuses develop from zygotes, from the ovum to the zygotes to the embryo to the fetus. Body cell. So if any of you have taken biochem or any kind of class on this type of stuff, it is extremely fascinating. And I encourage everybody to, I know you guys have a lot going on right now, but if you ever get a chance just to really study some DNA stuff, it's completely fascinating how our body is made and how billions of things are happening in our body in a matter of seconds. It's beyond comprehension sometimes when you really look at it. So I just found this little picture I thought was great about this is you. Your body's made up of trillions of cells. This is a cell, this is a nucleus, and the nucleus of each cell contains a chromosome. It shows the picture of the chromosome, which we'll talk about how important those are with heredity. Chromosome is made up of strands of DNA. And on that left of the picture is that strand of DNA that's coded throughout your body billions of times a day. And a section of the DNA is a gene. Genes carry inherited, can't even read that. Anyways, we are all made up of our parents' genetic makeup and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and so on and so forth. Okay. So, the human body contains millions of cells at birth, but life begins with a single cell created by the fusion of sperm and ovum, as we learned with fertilization. So DNA is a genetic code that controls the development and function of the cell. It also can be what causes genetic disorders. So that's a whole nother school of thought and study, and we'll talk a little bit about that today too. Okay, so the genes and chromosomes in the DNA determine individual traits. RNA, by the way, is just the transporter. DNA is what actually has our genetic makeup, okay? It's the master protein that controls the development and function of all cells. So each contains 46 chromosomes, which I would know all this if I were you guys. 22 pairs of autosomes, 1 pair of sex chromosomes, which we'll get more into that, okay? Biological development influenced by teratogens, external environment. So if somebody works in a place where there's a lot of chemicals, or how about if a patient has bad acne and the patient's a woman and she takes Accutane. Accutane is teratogen. It causes damage to the fetus. In fact, if a woman takes Accutane and is pregnant, 100% of those fetuses are born basically monsters. So that's why they, at least they used to, always do a pregnancy test before they would ever prescribe Accutane to a woman. Okay, drug use. We see way too much of that these days and the effects it has on a baby and the developing embryo fetus. And the sad part is a lot of people quit in pregnancy, alcohol, smoking, drugs, but the first 3 months, as we'll find out, the first trimester is when the development is happening. And nowadays people can find out earlier, but a lot of people still don't. And that's when we can run into some major issues with problems with fetuses and newborns, and then when they get developing their milestones. Okay, so in undernutrition, they're finding so much with prenatal care during the prenatal period that's just so important. We always knew it was important, but now they're finding it is extremely important. We can catch things, we can fix things before they become a problem, especially if women plan their pregnancies, which a lot of people don't, and that's okay. Just saying, if you really, really want to give your baby the best shot you can, plan it. Okay, and then of course smoking. I think we all know what a huge effect that has on a newborn. Think about the nicotine and the effects that has. If you see a baby's umbilical cord from someone who smokes a pack a day of cigarettes, it is this flimsy little thing that you don't even know how oxygen got to the fetus through it. So that's a big part of the problem with smokers is oxygen to the placenta, then to, of course, the fetus. Okay, so cell division and let's start off the morning right here. Gametogenesis, okay? So genesis, beginning of. So mitosis is a process that is a continuous process where the body grows, develops, dead cells are replaced. Each daughter cell contains the same number of chromosomes as the parent cell, so diploid, Di2, right? Process of mitosis for sperm is spermatogenesis, beginning of, and process of mitosis for ovum is oogenesis. We learned those terms previously. Okay, so meiosis is reproductive cells undergo two divisions. So the number of chromosomes is 23 per cell, with only one sex chromosome called the haploid. So this will all make more sense as we continue along, okay? At fertilization, the new cell contains 23 chromosomes from the sperm. So in other words, dad sends over 23 chromosomes. Mom contributes 23 from the ova, and there's where we get our 46. Okay, formation of gametes by this type of cell division is gametogenesis. So cell division, I just thought this was a very good depiction of how it happens. There's a picture in your book on page 34. On the left is spermatogenesis, on the right is oogenesis. And it just shows how the X's and the Y's and the splits, and it kind of just puts it into perspective for you. Okay, fertilization. Of course, this is what we have to have happen to have a baby. So at the time of fertilization, the sperm and the ovum unite. So again, mom sends 23, dad says 23 chromosomes to total 46 in the fetus or embryo, zygote, whatever you want to call it at this point. Okay, and that's really important for you guys to know, just saying. All right, so occurs when a sperm penetrates an ovum and they unite. Takes place in the outer third of the fallopian tube. Again, good information to remember, near the ovary, by the way. As soon as it occurs, a chemical change in the membrane around the fertilized ovum prevents further sperm from penetrating the ovum. That's why, you know, how many sperm are released in one ejaculation? A lot. So can you imagine being pregnant with that many? There had to be a system to stop more sperms from getting through, right? Now, when we get into multiples more, it'll be, you know, so 2 eggs, mom dropped 2 eggs and got fertilized by 2 different sperm. That is fraternal twins. The identical twins are 1 egg splits. So it's still 1 sperm and 1 egg. So 1 sperm got through, that chemical change happened, formed that membrane, so no other sperms could get through, and those sperms die off. So here's the process of fertilization. I just wanted you to see on over to the right, that's in the outer third of the fallopian tube, right? And it is, I just want to make sure I was telling you this one thing right. Okay, so you can see the fertilization happening, okay? The released oocyte down towards the bottom. So your egg is being released, the sperm goes in, does its fertilization, then it travels, then it turns into a zygote, then all these splits are happening until it finally gets down into the uterus. and you can see the posterior wall of the uterus. That is where implantation of that fertilized ova usually happens. Okay, that's where we want it to happen. If it implants other places or not very well, bad things can happen. Okay. So I liked this little nursing tip that's in your book on page 35. It says, during sexual counseling, the nurse should emphasize that the survival time of sperm ejaculated into the area of the cervix. It doesn't have to be in the cervix, in that area, maybe up to 5 days, and that pregnancy can occur with intercourse 5 days before ovulation even happens. So think about it. They have sexual intercourse, sperm is released, 5 days later the woman ovulates, and that sperm is still alive and goes to do what it's supposed to do. So there's where a lot of unplanned pregnancies happen because people don't realize that. And kind of think that might be on your test. Okay. Sex determination. There's more to it than we first thought, but the main premise of sex determination is the X's and the Y's. Okay? Sperm can carry either an X or a Y chromosome. Male determines the gender of the fetus. So, the pH of the female reproductive tract and her estrogen levels also influence the survival rate of the X and Y bearing sperm. So, in other words, if mom has what they call, I'm calling this a true terminology here, hostile environment to sperm. Sometimes only certain swimmers can get through that environment, and that might be the girl gene, the X. Okay, sometimes the male just sends over Y's, and that's all boys. Sometimes the male sends over X's, that's girls. Sometimes the male sends over both, but the woman's pH kills off one of them. So the reason why that happens is male sperm, the Y's, are fast, but they're not really sturdy. The female sperm are slow and steady. So you can see how that could affect boys, girls, that type of thing. So it's not always the male's fault. They always say male determines the sex, which he does because he sends over the genetic X or Y. But what the female does with it makes a difference too. Okay? I had a patient one time that she had a girl and he wanted a boy. And I want to say they had 3 girls already, and he walked out and never came back. That was like, wow, okay, well, buddy, you sent over that genetic content. Okay, so you can just see in the picture down on the bottom right about the X's and the Y's. Sex determination. So gender is determined by the father's sperm at fertilization. Conception and birth of a child of a certain sex is a source of concern to some families in China. Well, let's not talk about viruses right now. Let's just talk about, they can only have one child. And males are very revered over there, at least that used to be the way it was. And girls weren't always the necessarily wanted sex. Might have changed a bit these days, but I do know there's still issues with traditional families. Okay, inheritance. This is where it gets super interesting. Each gene is coded for inheritance. And I just really liked this picture, okay, of the traits in humans. Okay, so like hair color, eye color, what is our chin going to look like? Does it going to have the little dimple in it? Because that is a genetic trait, okay? So dominant usually overpowers recessive, and it's passed on to the offspring. So you can just take a look. I think that's in our book also somewhere maybe. Anyways, it just talks about dominant and recessive. All right, tubal transport of the zygote. Okay, so just remember, look at the picture on the right. First is the egg that gets fertilized, the ovum, right? Then the zygote is formed. So you can see that's next. Transported through the fallopian tube into the uterus. During this transport, as you can see on the right, zygote undergoes rapid mitotic division, known as cleavage. So you can see as it's splitting. Size of zygote does not increase, but the individual cells become smaller as they divide, then form a solid ball. That is known as the morula. So look at how it starts out as the egg, just one little thing in the center, then zygote 2, then 2-cell stage, it has split. Then 4, you can see into 4s. Morula, look at that. Look at all those cells that have split. And then the blastocyte. Okay, implantation of the zygote. Again, here's that picture of what happens. Then on the right, this one is in your book too, on page 37. It just shows, okay, so now we have this little zygote in there. Could be an embryo by now. It doesn't say what age it is. But anyways, and it just shows where the placenta is, the umbilical cord going to that little embryo, the amnion, the chorion, which we're going to talk about, all the things that matter in a pregnancy. So morula is very important. The size of the zygote doesn't increase. Again, the individual cells become smaller as they divide, and this is what this big ball is the morula. It enters the uterus on the 3rd day after fertilization, floats for another 2 to 4 days. Cells form a cavity, then 2 distinct layers evolve. The inner layer is called the blastocyte, and that's what develops into an embryo and embryonic membranes. Outer layer is a trophoblast, develops into the embryonic membrane chorion. So in other words, where the baby's going to live in that sac, amnion and chorion. So implantation of the zygote. So we have a zygote now. So all the splitting has been done. It's come down the fallopian tube. And it implants usually in the upper section of the posterior uterine wall. So the back of the uterus, right? So cells burrow into the prepared lining. So our body has done this whole unique thing once fertilization happened. Now this endometrium, the lining of the uterus, the inner lining of the uterus, remember that? En, I say is in. And now this endometrium is called decidua. Area under blastocyte is decidua basalis. It becomes the maternal part of the placenta. So everything's starting to form. You can see how in that short of a time, all the things that have to happen. You used to hear more about miscarriages. You actually hear now too, because you find out so early. But that was why is this whole process had to happen just right. And if it didn't, the body rejects it, and there's a miscarriage. So that's why women can get a positive pregnancy test, and then we'll talk about HCG, but the hormone HCG levels all of a sudden start declining. Well, they've lost this pregnancy, and it's usually because the body has found something is wrong, something didn't go right. Development, cell differentiation. Okay, so cell differentiation, what's happening? Okay, occurs after implantation. Special functions, so the chorion, and we're going to talk about what all these things are. Amnion. Amnion is pretty obvious. Amniotic sac, okay, the bag of water. Yolk sac, and primary germ levels. So let's get into what all that means. Chorion develops from the trophoblast, envelops the amnion, embryo, and yolk sac. Thick membrane and it has projections called the villi. You know, those little finger-like projections we've talked about. They extend into the decidua basalis on the uterine wall. So in other words, it's implanting into the wall of the uterus. Those little fingers grab a hold and implants in there. And it forms the embryonic fetal portion of the placenta. So remember, in the placenta, part of it's maternal, part of it is fetal. The amnion to the right, I just thought that was super cool. That's an amniotic sac. That's literally what it looks like if you take it out of the mom's uterus. This is a real picture. This is probably a C-section delivering a footling breech, because you can see 2 feet there, okay? And you can see that it is encircled. The feet have fluid around them, and we'll talk about that. So amnion is the second membrane. It's the thin structure that envelops and protects the embryo. The amnion is super, super important. It's the amniotic sac. It's the bag of waters. It's what protects that fetus the whole time of pregnancy. So together, the chorion and amnion form an amniotic sac filled with fluid. So they fuse together to form that sac. So that's why we call it the bag of water, all right? So amniotic fluid is 98% water. It's clear, but can also be a little bit slightly straw colored. Mild odor, but not a foul odor, just different. If it's a foul odor, that's not normal. May contain bits of vernix, which vernix is, if you ever see a newborn, or even if you haven't, they can be, especially if they're born early, they're born with this white film over them. It's this sticky stuff that's super good for their skin and protects their skin. And usually on term babies, you see it like under their arms and in their creases and stuff. And we always tell parents, don't scrub that off. It's really good for their skin. But that's what vernix is. And lanugo. Lanugo is fetal hair. It can cover a baby's body. It can be on their shoulders. They can be born with it. Not. It's just this fine, fine little tufts of hair on them. And then fetal urine. You know, as the fetus grows, they swallow amniotic fluid and then they pee it out. And that's what continues the cycle of amniotic fluid. So volume of fluid in that amniotic sac steadily increases from 30 mils at 10 weeks to 350 mils at 20 weeks. And at 37 weeks, fluid is 1,000 mils. Okay, so what you should know, and of course later on in our classes we'll get to it, but oligo is too little fluid. Poly, as you can imagine, P-O-L-Y, you've used that in your medical terminology, is too much, okay, a lot. So that's over the amount. So it would be over 1,000 mils. Sometimes it can be 2,000 mils. Women can get so much fluid that when their water breaks, it literally looks like a little flood happening. You can't believe how many towels you have to use. And if they have that much fluid, there's usually something that's wrong with that fetus, usually GI. Oligo is associated with kidney, too little fluid. And when we get into all that with pathophysiology and oxygenation and stuff, babies shunt from their kidneys fetuses shunt from their kidneys when they're not getting enough oxygen, and they shunt it to their major organs. So one of the things that we can tell if a patient has oligohydramnios, so water, too little amount of water, that baby has chronic hypoxia, not enough oxygen. So right there, critical thinking. Okay, my patient comes in, has oligohydramnios. Why? Is she a smoker? Does she not eat right? Does she have lung disorders to begin with? Does she have asthma? Anything that could have caused less oxygenation to that fetus during the pregnancy, where the fetus felt that it had to shunt away from its kidney to feed its brain, heart, and adrenals. That's where a fetus shunts to. So it's very interesting how it all works together. Okay, so amniotic fluid exceeding 1,000 mils at term is known as, yes, polyhydramnios. Oligo, remember, is not enough. Poly is too much. Now, you will hear the term throughout this book even that says hydramnios. It doesn't put the poly in front of it. Same thing. They use it synonymously, but in my world, it's always been called polyhydramnios. Functions of the amniotic fluid. Super, super important. If a mom stops making amniotic fluid early on in the pregnancy, the fetus can't grow. The lungs can't mature because they are not allowed to expand, things like that. We had a 17-weeker one time that became very, very controversial in our old birth center. This was years and years ago. She went to a doctor's appointment and found that, I wonder if she was more than 17 weeks. I think she was over 20 weeks, and that's why it got so controversial. Anyway, the doctor and the patient herself and husband made a decision to abort the fetus because she had no fluid. So it was incompatible with life for this fetus, and she didn't want to carry it to term like that. Well, in our hospital, it's an Adventist hospital, we don't do abortions. So it became quite an ethical dilemma. And so they called the ethics committee together, and we all gathered around, and some of the nurses were not comfortable at all, pretty much refused to take care of the patient. I'm very different that way in the sense of I felt like that mom was losing her baby, and it was her choice when to lose that baby. And I wanted to respect their wishes. So my friend and I double teamed her, and they let us do that. And we gave her what's called laminaria. And it's a seaweed that we'll probably learn about later on, but it's seaweed that's in these little long, they look like a straw, but short, made out of seaweed. And the doctor puts them in the cervix, and what happens is when fluids get into that seaweed, they expand and they open up the cervix enough to get that tiny of a fetus out. And it was horribly sad, but that fetus was incompatible with life. So in the obstetrical world, there's good and bad, and I think you guys are going to find that there's going to be a lot of things that make you sad and upset. Pregnant women in the class oftentimes have to leave the classroom. They get scared. And my class is not meant to scare you. It's to tell you the reality of what we see and what happens. Thank God those are the exceptions to the rule. And but as nurses, I think it's a good example of choices you oftentimes have to make with your patient. If you're going to be a patient advocate, or if you're how you feel about things in your life prevent you from doing that. And they gave the nurses choices, which I respected tremendously. And like I said, my friend and I were comfortable with that. Did we love it? Oh God, no. It was horrible. It was horrible. But it was more horrible for that mother and her husband losing their little boy. So choices have to be made, but you can see how important the amniotic sac was. The baby's lungs were not developing at all because she, for some reason, wasn't making amniotic fluid. Something went wrong with her placenta, okay? Anyways, back to the functions. Maintains an even temperature in that sac, and that's why they say mothers shouldn't sit in hot tubs. You can sit in bathtubs because it cools off. Hot tubs stay a steady temperature, so if you sit in there for 30 minutes, you can, basically cook your baby a little bit in there. It prevents the amniotic sac from adhering to the fetal skin, which was happening with that one I was telling you about. Allows symmetrical growth of the fetus. allows buoyancy and fetal movement. Babies need to move to grow. So super important to have that buoyancy. Acts as a cushion to protect the fetus and umbilical cord from injury. Think about all the things that happen. If you have a toddler at home, they jump on your belly. There's all kinds of things. A car accident, that fluid in there has saved many a fetus from things like that. And sometimes it doesn't. I knew a vet I grew up in Napa, and she went out and was working on a very gentle horse, and for some reason the horse decided to kicked her in the abdomen, and it killed the fetus. So it can't protect us from everything, but it sure does a good job for the most part. Okay, moving on. So page 38, the yolk sac. Pretty interesting. It's a cavity that develops on the 9th day after fertilization. See how each day makes the difference? And believe it or not, each day throughout the whole 40 weeks of pregnancy makes a difference. Functions only during embryonic life. So remember, it is a zygote, embryo, then a fetus. Initiates production of red blood cells. And what are red blood cells? They carry oxygen. They carry the hemoglobin. So that's super important. Continues until fetal liver takes over at around 6 weeks. And the umbilical cord encompasses the yolk sac, which then degenerates. So I thought it was kind of cool. I found this picture of the yolk sac. And it's interesting, my friend who is my age, she late in life got remarried and all of a sudden found herself pregnant. Well, then she goes for an ultrasound and they said, well, all we see is the yolk sac, nothing else. There's no embryo, there's no anything going on there. We're going to need to induce. And she said, no, I want to let it happen naturally. She had 2 grown boys, and all of a sudden she's kind of feeling pregnant. And she goes back, sure enough, there's a little embryo in there. At this point, it might have even been a fetus, 9 weeks. And it was her little girl who is now in college to become a nurse. Anyway, it's interesting how stuff like that happens. Germ layers, really important. So the zygote in the blastocyte stage transforms into 3 primary germ layers: the ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm. Okay, endo, inside, right? Each germ layer develops into a different part of the growing embryo. Just beyond fascinating and beyond miraculous. Okay, so let's start with the ectoderm. It is the outer layer of the skin, oil glands and hair follicles of the skin, nails and hair, external sense organs, mucous membranes of mouth and anus. Mesoderm, true skin, skeleton, bone and cartilage, connective tissue, muscles, blood and blood vessels, kidneys and gonads. Endoderm, lining of the trachea, pharynx and bronchi, lining of digestive tract, lining of bladder and urethra. It still amazes me all the things that have to happen in all the healthy babies that are born. The system works correctly. It's just awesome. Okay. Prenatal developmental milestones. So zygote, again, cell formed by union of sperm and ovum. So the very first thing. Embryo. You guys have to know the differentiation here. 2nd to 8th week of development. Fetus, 9th week until birth. Age of viability, 20 weeks of gestation. Now, I take exception to this, but requires NICU care to survive. 20 weeks, if it's a true 20-weeker, dates, everything are perfect. They are born alive, but rarely do they live. And if they do live, they 99.9% of them will have tremendous sequelae, blindness, deafness, cerebral palsy. Just, it's a, at 20 weeks, at our hospital and most of the hospitals I know, they don't even offer the option of heroics. Now, where it gets sticky is 22, 23 weeks. 24 weeks is kind of a norm to 25 weeks where they save these babies, do heroics. 20 weeks, I use more of a term of, yes, they are viable, they can live, but they are born alive, I should say, but they usually don't make it. Their eyes aren't open, their skin, you can see this little baby to the right. They're just teeny, teeny, tiny. I've had several born for me, and probably the youngest was 24 weeks. And in one night at our little birth center, we had a 24-weeker and a 25-weeker. The 24-weeker is kind of an interesting story. She was 18 years old. She was up at Pinecrest, because as you know, I live in Sonora, and she was camping with her mother and her aunt. Had not told them she was pregnant. She got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and her water broke. Yeah. So she has to go back to their tent and say, oh, by the way, Mom and Auntie, I'm pregnant and my water just broke. So they bring her to the birth center, and the fetal monitor strip is looking terrible. The baby's in distress, and we call the pediatrician in and we deliver this baby. And we kept it alive, shipped it, and then we shipped this baby out to Modesto, DMC. Then we had another patient who had a placenta previa, which means their placenta is lying over the os of the cervix, and she started bleeding, 25 weeks, and we had to rush her back for an emergency C-section because it wouldn't stop bleeding. And the interesting part is the first one, they both were 1 pound 9 ounces, which is kind of interesting. And the first one passed away. The second one, I happen to know the grandmother, and he has a few developmental issues, and he has really bad lungs, asthma, and gets sick with lung issues a lot. But other than that, has done very well. So it's kind of cool when you can follow up on that. But it just shows, okay, how much oxygenation was that fetus getting, how much reserve. That has a lot to do with if they're going to make it and if they're going to make it okay. Okay. Folic acid and neural tube defects. Man, was that a great discovery when we figured that out. So folic acid supplements can prevent most neural tube defects such as spina bifida, which is super cool because we used to see a lot more spina bifidas, and those babies used to be crippled, and bowel and bladder dysfunction. So early prenatal care, as you can see, again, here's another reason for early prenatal care. With good nutrition and folic acid supplements are desirable to protect this embryo in the first day and weeks of development. We had a patient come in labor. It was her second baby. And all of a sudden, and then I found out she delivered. Super neat family. I knew the family and everything, just great people. And all of a sudden the nurse comes running out and says, we need the pediatrician. And I said, what's going on? And said, there's a weird thing on the baby's back. So I go running in there, and it was this probably about the size of a flatter orange, about that big. And it was very gelatinous with just weird little things in the center on the baby's spine. And somebody said, I think it's spina bifida. I'm like, spina bifida? They would have seen that on ultrasound. It was just so odd. So what you do, of course, is come to find out, yes, it was spina bifida. And what the gelatinous stuff was cerebral spinal fluid. And in the center was literally the nerves coming from the spinal cord that were exposed. So we had to be super careful with this baby. And what you do is you put moist saline sterile gauze over it to keep it moist. And then they do surgery. Well, I went back and looked and I thought, how in the world did they not catch this on ultrasound? Well, on ultrasound, they made a comment we're unable to visualize fetal spine due to fetal position. So they never got a good look at the spine. So that's why it was so unexpected. From what I hear, this baby walks and runs and things like that, but still has some bowel bladder control issues. Depends, of course, as we all know, with quadriplegia and paraplegia, where it happens in the spine as to what it's going to affect. But folic acid, big deal. I wanted you to see this, the Carnegie Stages of Human Development. Just super cool that you can see the whole process. This shows up to 23 weeks, and it's just super neat how this little zygote embryo fetus develops. Okay, prenatal development. Here's your embryo at 3 weeks, okay? And that is on page 39 in your book. As you can see, it has the neural groove, and this is where a lot of stuff happens at 3 weeks. It's where first pairs of somites, the yolk sac, just a lot is happening at 3 weeks gestation. Okay, fetal development. I thought this was super cool too. I don't think this is in your book. I think I added this. 14th week, fetal movement. 20th week, fetus may survive outside of the uterus. 28th week, surfactant, which is needed for lungs, fetal lungs, is minimal and is needed to help keep alveoli in lungs open. So we'll get into later dates about fetal or respiratory distress. But what happens when babies are born premature is they take that first deep breath, which is the biggest breath of their life. And what's supposed to happen is it takes the fluid out of the alveoli of the lungs, fills it up with air, and surfactant holds those alveoli open. Well, if you don't have enough surfactant, each time the alveoli collapse. So the babies have to take their first deep breath for every breath, and then babies wear out. And that's when they have to go on respirators, things like that. These days they can give surfactant, which is super cool, but they usually do that in level 2, level 3 nurseries. Okay, 40th week is considered full term and ready to survive outside of the uterus. And on the right, you can see the age of the embryo, what is developing, like week 5, the eyes, the heart, the limbs, week 6, ears, teeth. So it's interesting when you have a defect, when a baby's born, an anomaly, you can go back and say, okay, something happened at week 6. What happened with this embryo at week 6 that caused this baby? Like one time we had a baby born with no ears. That was unexpected. And then you just look to see. And babies' brains, fetuses' brains continue to develop till the 40th week. They say 38-week full terms, but they have done studies, the March of Dimes, that baby brains are developing till the 40th week. Okay, so let's go. So fetus, 17 and 25 weeks, those are in your book also. By 28 weeks, the eyes open, fetal position in the uterus is more stable, and 25 weeks is when we feel good about a baby making it in life and surviving and doing okay. You don't know what kind of sequelae problems they're going to have down the road, but 25 weeks is kind of a comfort level for us. 33 weeks is kind of my favorite if they're going to be a preemie. They usually do pretty darn well. Okay, so embryo at 29 and 36 weeks. So at 29 weeks, They are in, as you can see, head down, which is cephalic or vertex position. Their central nervous system is functioning. Skin is less wrinkled because now they're getting some subcutaneous fat. Their spleen stops forming blood cells, and the bone marrow starts doing that. Okay? Increased surfactant is present in the lungs. At 36 weeks, subcu fat is present, skin is pink and smooth, they can grasp, their reflex to grasp, circumference of the head and abdomen are equal, and surge in lung surfactant production occurs. We deliver a lot of 36-weekers, and they usually do well. Some of them don't. Again, depends on how healthy the mom was to begin with, things like that. Okay, so we're going to now talk about placenta, umbilical cords, and fetal circulation, and we're going to do multiple gestations. Okay, accessory structures of pregnancy. One of them is the placenta, also known as the afterbirth. The most important organ for pregnancy. This is what goes from mom to fetus. All goes through here. The umbilical cord goes from the placenta to the fetus, and fetal circulation, of course, that's what supports the fetus. Placenta is a temporary endocrine organ that provides nourishment and oxygen to the fetus. It's responsible for fetal respirations, nutrition, and excretion. Now, people are like, what do you mean fetal respirations? They don't breathe. Yes, their lungs are full of fluid, but they do practice movements so that when they're born, they know how to breathe. It produces 4 hormones: progesterone, estrogen, HCG, and HPL. So fetal deoxygenated blood and waste products leave the fetus through 2 umbilical arteries. So how I like to remember that, arteries, away. It takes stuff away from the fetus, okay? The vein, so there's 1 vein, 2 arteries. The vein, think about V-E-I-N. It has the word in it, okay? So that's what's taking from mom through placenta into the fetus. So fetal and maternal blood do not normally mix, although I have some stories to tell you about that. Sometimes they do, and we don't always know why. But oxygenated, nutrient-rich blood from mother spurts into the intervillous space, which there's a picture in your book of the intervillous space in the placenta, from spiral arteries in the decidua. So those, the intervillous space bathes those vessels that feed the fetus in oxygenated rich blood. Fetal blood releases carbon dioxide and waste products. A little interesting tidbit that was in your book that, and I didn't know this, an enlarged placenta may signal maternal diabetes mellitus and may indicate increased morbidity of the fetus in the neonatal period or later stage of life. I didn't know placental size. I'm going to have to ask my doctors about that. I just hadn't heard that before. Okay. Continuing with placental transfer. So fetal blood takes oxygen and nutrients before returning to fetus through the umbilical vein. Many harmful substances can be transferred to the fetus, such as drugs, nicotine, viruses. That's why it's super important that we are, women that want to have kids are rubella immune, and like chickenpox, things like that. All those kinds of things can cause issues if early on in pregnancy, can cause issues for the fetus. And may cause fetal drug addiction. If mom takes too many drugs, you should see withdrawal of some of these babies. It is so, so hard to watch. Can cause congenital anomalies. So think about, again, when they don't know they're pregnant and they're out partying, having a grand time, and that's when that can get to that fetus and cause some issues, embryo, fetus, whichever. And fetal infection can be devastating. Placental hormones. Are you getting the picture that hormones play a huge part in pregnancy? So there's progesterone, functions during pregnancy, maintains the uterine lining for implantation of the zygote. Remember, I was telling you how some women have to have progesterone shots. Reduces uterine contractions to prevent spontaneous abortion. Prepares the glands of the breast for lactation and stimulates testes to produce testosterone, which aids the male fetus in developing the reproductive tract. So progesterone's a big deal. Estrogen stimulates uterine growth, increases blood flow to the uterine vessels, stimulates development of the breast ducts to prepare for lactation. And estrogen can also cause what women have, that skin pigmentation on their face, mask of pregnancy, vascular changes, increased salivation. Some women, I had a friend who got terribly sick during her pregnancy and kept having to spit. She had so much saliva. So all kinds of things, swelling. We have so much more volume as a pregnant person. Okay, HCG. It's a huge part of pregnancy. It's how we know we're pregnant usually. Causes the corpus luteum to persist and continue production of estrogen and progesterone to sustain the pregnancy. So when you talk about people who've had losses and they go to fertility specialists, that's one of the things that they check is their estrogen and progesterone levels, and they keep a very sharp eye on those levels. HCG is detectable in maternal blood as soon as implantation occurs, usually 7 to 9 days after fertilization. And I just showed a little pregnancy test that's showing the positive HCG. And HCG does quadruples, just astronomically goes up as pregnancy continues in the first few months. Okay, so a new patient has had blood drawn to determine if she's pregnant. Hormone responsible for a positive test result is okay, you got it. Number 1, HCG. HPL is also known as, you can read it for yourself, it causes decreased insulin sensitivity and utilization of glucose by the mother. So why we want that to happen is to make glucose available to the fetus to meet the growth needs. So you'll find that people that have diabetes in pregnancy, their insulin has to be followed very carefully and adjusted very differently than when they aren't pregnant because of these types of changes. Umbilical cord. You would be amazed what an umbilical cord can tell you. There is literally classes on cords and placentas out there. And there was a guy who used to give them that I really wanted to go hear the class, but he retired before I had a chance to go listen to him. But the reason why it matters is anybody who has seen a true umbilical cord, it's usually really swirly like a pigtail. And it is usually about 22 inches long. And if it's longer, it means something. If it's shorter, it means something. If it's not coiled, it means something. If it's super flat, it means something. How the cord is inserted into the placenta means something. There's all kinds of different terms for that. But the main thing about it that we need to learn right now is it's the lifeline between the mother and the fetus. 2 arteries carry blood away, remember away from the fetus. 1 vein in returns the blood to the fetus. Wharton's jelly. So look to the right on the top. See that yellowish stuff on that cord? What you're seeing in the front is a cut cord and the vessels, and we're going to look at that in a second. But on top, you can see that like fibrous looking stuff. That's Wharton's jelly. And it's cushiony. and it really cushions those cords, and that's why a lot of women who are heavy smokers or heavy bad asthmatics, things like that, their cords don't get as protected, so the fetal heart monitor strip might not look as good. They don't have the Wharton's jelly to protect it. So Wharton's jelly is pretty important. Then we talked about the length, and the umbilical cord usually protrudes near the center of the placenta. What I wanted you to look at to the right is the vessels. So you can see 3 dots there. On the left are the 2 arteries, on the right is the vein. And it's opposite in adults as fetuses. We normally think as arteries as the huge ones. In this case, the vein is the big one, the arteries are the small one. Okay, so good, easy way to remember it is AVA. You know the name, AVA. So artery, vein, artery. Just a very easy way to remember how many of each is in there, okay? I also liked this Healthy People 2030, one of the health promotion boxes on page 43. The growth of the fetus is limited by the nutrients and oxygen received from the mother. A mother's ability to nourish her fetus is established in her own fetal life and by her adult nutritional experience. Therefore, to prevent illness in the next generation, there must be a focus on the health practices of this generation. Healthy mother can produce a healthy child who is less prone to develop illness. So again, prenatal care, we need to have good diets, exercise, be careful with if our jobs are dangerous, things like that. There's just so many things we can do. Make sure we have enough iodine. I thought I had put this in here, and maybe it's later on. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, but or maybe we already, oh yeah, I think we talked about it in the previous lecture, how iodine is so important too, and can cause issues. But anyways, moving on. Here's that maternal fetal circulation, okay? So this is a piece of the placenta that they're showing you. And you can see where these vessels here, the chorionic villi right there, are getting bathed in maternal oxygenated blood, going into the umbilical cord and taken through to the fetus by the vein, right? In. Fetal circulation. So I would know your ducts if I were you. Foramen ovale, it's very important. It diverts most blood from the right atrium directly to the left atrium rather than circulating it to the lungs. We don't need it to circulate to the lungs right now because the lungs are filled with fluid, right? And you'll see that this foramen ovale is an open hole between the 2 atria. Ductus arteriosus, that's the one we talked about in one of the other chapters that doesn't close until several hours of age, and the one that can cause problems when it's closing if there's issues. It diverts most blood from the pulmonary artery into the aorta. So you can see how it's lungs and heart, and that's why it's such an issue when it starts closing if something's wrong with the lungs or the heart. Ductus venosus diverts some blood away from the liver as it returns from the placenta. So circulation before birth. Blood enters the fetal body through the umbilical vein. About half goes to the liver. The remainder enters the inferior vena cava through the ductus venosus, then goes through the foramen ovale. Remember, that's in the atria. Then the ductus arteriosus. Blood containing waste products now is returned to the placenta through the umbilical arteries. Remember, away. Now, I'd really like you guys to look, this YouTube video, I usually show it in class, Fetal Circulation by Gregory Karapetian. It's 5 minutes and 39 seconds, and if you go under YouTube and just put in fetal circulation and find this one, super super good. He explains the circulation and is super interesting too, what happens to these things when the ducts close. So circulation after birth now. The foramen ovale closes within 2 hours after birth. None of them close permanently at birth, but by 3 months of age. Ductus arteriosus, see, closes within 15 hours. So, but it can close in 8 hours, it can close in 24 hours. We had a real bad cardiac, I think I told you this, cardiac baby that turned, no, I don't think I did. I was brand new at the old birth center, and they were teaching me the stabilization nursery, which is where we call them bad babies and sick babies and deal with them, whether we try to get them better or ship them out to a higher level of care. Sometimes they just need a little oxygen. Sometimes they need heart surgery. So it just depends on what's wrong with them. So we had this nurse, her name was Marlene, and she was giving the night, we used to have LVNs in our nursery at night. And there was a few babies in the nursery, and Marlene said, okay, Flora, go on a break. I'll watch the babies for you. She had them all bathed and in their cribs and all taken care of. This was before rooming in stuff. And this is why it scares me, the rooming in stuff, because of this type of thing. But so far, so good. Anyway, so Marlene was in there giving a break, and she was checking the babies, and one of them just turned blue before her very eyes. She grabbed that baby. I remember she had that baby in stabilization nursery, wrapped up in a bow, shipped within 2 hours. We'll come to find out the ductus was closing, and the baby had an unknown cardiac defect, and it needed that open duct to get enough oxygenated blood to keep it going. We ended up we carry it now, but back then we didn't. It's a prostaglandin that you get. And so DMC sent code 3. They sent up the prostaglandin that you give the baby, and it keeps the duct open for as long as you need it open until that baby can get the care it needs. And this baby had to have surgery and unfortunately passed away because it was incompatible with life. But we didn't know it at the time. And this was, a long time ago, so I think it was something that ultrasounds have gotten so much better these days with things like that. But that baby just turned, by the time I saw the baby, it was purple black. It was so scary. But Marlene was phenomenal and got that baby out of there and to the care it needed. Okay, anyways, moving on to the ductus venosus, closes functionally when the cord is cut. So basically at delivery, permanently at about 1 week. After permanent closure, this is so cool, and if you watch that video on YouTube, which please do, it's only a little over 5 minutes, the ductus arteriosus and ductus venosus become ligaments. So interesting. And the foramen ovale becomes this, what do they call it? A cartilage between the atria. Okay, so now we're on to page 42. Impaired prenatal development, so undernutrition, can result in permanent changes in fetal structure, physiology, and metabolism. And we aren't talking about mom being 90 pounds and anorexic. We're talking not getting the right kind of nutrition also that a fetus needs. Can influence development of conditions such as heart disease and stroke when that baby becomes an adult because their tissues have not been made strong enough. Exposure to toxins in utero can also influence health in later life. All the studies they're doing these days are just showing the effects of all this later. We know so much more now than we used to. Okay, impaired prenatal development. Intrauterine growth restriction, which means that fetus is smaller than it should be at the weeks of gestation it is. So I'll give you an example. One time we had a 40-week baby that was 4 pounds, full-term baby, but had such growth restriction, something happened with that placenta that was not feeding that fetus. It can predispose to the development of specific diseases later in life. It literally can reduce the number of cells in the organs. So that's long-term effects. Fetal growth best assessed when weight, length of gestation, placental size, and newborn head and abdominal circumference are considered. So this is something why they do ultrasounds periodically, to make sure that the growth is staying consistent. Asymmetrical intrauterine growth restriction, you have a baby with a big old head and a tiny little body. Well, again, that's because it's been shunting its oxygen to the brain and not the periphery. And those are babies that we induce early because they're at very high risk. Fetal growth limited by nutrients and oxygen received from the mother. A healthy mother can produce a healthy child who is less prone to illness. Again, why we want to have good prenatal care. Just want to make one other statement about the umbilical cord that I forgot to say, and it's in your book on page 42. But remember I told you how it's very pathologic what the cord looks like? Remember I told you the coiled? Well, it's a good point they put here. They're coiled within the cord to allow movement and stretching without restricting circulation. So if there wasn't that give in the cord and the baby's swimming all around, it could tighten it too much and limit oxygenation. So that's the reason for the coiling in the cord. So that's why when you have a straight cord, who knows what happened in there. Okay, so now we're on to page 43. Undernutrition, again, in utero can permanent changes in fetal structure, physiology, metabolism, development of chronic conditions later in life. And of course, to prevent this in our next generation, let's get healthy in this generation. Let's give our kids a good start. Multifetal pregnancy, super interesting. Twins occur in 33.5 out of 1,000 pregnancies in the U.S. When hormones are used to assist with ovulation, you guys have heard of a lot of these medications that women are given, Clomid, things like that, to help with fertility. Twinning and other multifetal pregnancies occur. Monozygotic twins are from a single fertilized ovum. Those are your identical twins. They're always the same sex. They're genetically identical because they're from one egg and one sperm. Dizygotic, so mono, one. So one egg, one sperm, one placenta, things like that, okay? Di, two, are from separate fertilized ovum. They're the fraternal, or not identical. Always have 2 amnions, 2 chorions, and 2 placentas. I just thought these were awesome pictures of identical twins. We get to do twins at my birth center. We don't do anything more than twins, but we deliver twins. And look how super cute. Can you see how identical these guys are? So one egg, one sperm. Super cute. All right. Same-sex twins with separate placentas can be fraternal or identical. It's all in the when it happened, when the egg split, things like that. For health reasons, it's good to know whether your twins are fraternal or identical. Sometimes placentas fuse, and we don't know that on ultrasound, and we think that they're, one placenta, and it's actually 2 that have fused, things like that. All kinds of things can happen with twins. So, although identical twins have the same genes, they don't always look the same. It's because children's health and development are shaped not just by genes, but also by experiences in the womb and after. Fetal movement, how much oxygen did one get versus the other, things like that. You can see identical twins where one had cerebral palsy, the other didn't. Well, maybe one got more of the oxygen than the other, things like that. So, and IUGR, one twin received less blood from the shared placenta, and it may weigh less than the other one. It gets very interesting if you study multiples. Here's another case where this isn't in your book, I just added this because I thought it was interesting. Some identical twins are mirror twins. In other words, if they look in the mirror, they're identical. For example, their hair parts on opposite sides, oppositely handed, or they have birthmarks on opposite sides of their body. Some rare cases, their internal organs can actually be the mirror image of each other. It's not known why some twins are like this. It was a patient of mine. They had mirror twins, two little girls, and it's very interesting. In very rare cases, twins can be born called conjoined. They used to call them Siamese twins, but now they call them conjoined. And it can happen if the fertilized egg splits quite late after fertilization. So it matters day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, day 12 of when the split happens, of what kind of twins you're going to get. And again, sometimes it's hard to know. They have to do genetic studies later to find out if they're identical or not. Multi-fetus. So on the left, you see identical. On the right, you see fraternal. So on the left, you see one egg that's fertilized, splits, and you can see the two. Now, some are in one sac, some are in two sacs. You pray that they're in two sacs. If they share a sac, very, very, very dangerous, very high risk. Usually have to live in a hospital after a certain amount of weeks pregnancy because their cords become entangled. The twins become entangled with each other and can have major cord accidents. They're just super high risk. But you can see the one placenta, two sacs, two cords, but they both go to the same placenta. Okay, that's what matters. On the right, the fraternal, you can see two fertilized eggs, then the blastocytes that split, and then you see two placentas, two babies, two cords, two sacs, two everything. So that's what differentiates them. So, will monozygotic twins always be the same sex? Yes, true. Mono, one. Mono means one placenta, one sac. Those are the most dangerous of all twins to be pregnant with. Okay. So just keep in mind that dizygotic twins always have two amnions, two chorions, two placentas, and sometimes the placenta fuses, but dizygotic twin pregnancies tend to repeat in families, and the incidence does increase with maternal age, not usually the identical twins, the mono. Many twins or higher multiples are born prematurely. Think about the stretch in that abdomen. The body perceives, okay, I'm ready to be born because that uterus is so big now. We still don't know what totally starts labor. It's a signal that is sent, and it gets sent early in twins and triplets a lot. And it's usually that overdistension. And many twins are born early because the placentas may not be able to supply sufficient nutrient to both fetuses, especially with the identical twins. Okay, so just remember, go over your key points. I'll answer questions as I can. Email me if you need me, and that concludes our week 1 of lecture. Hopefully every week it'll just get better and maybe someday back in the classroom. Have a good day.